Okay, let's get started. Thank you everybody for joining. Hopefully you're all Airbnb employees. I want to start with a personal story about which explains why I'm here today. And then we'll get into the heart of the content about the 5 steps you can take as an Airbnb employee to make the most of your Airbnb RSUs. So the reason I'm here today, I want to take you back to the late 90s. And I was working at a tech startup. It was a .com. And I can remember the day like it was yesterday. I looked around and there were people popping champagne, high-fiving each other. And we were all very excited because we'd done what every tech startup at that time wanted to do. We had just had our IPO. And so everybody was happy. And then what happened was we had our IPO, the stock kept going up and up, and everybody was even happier. And at a certain point, 6-9 months down the road, I thought to myself, oh, if this keeps happening, if the stock keeps going up, I may be able to stop working pretty soon. Now, for those of you who know history, in the early 2000s, the dot-com bubble burst, and I was at a dot-com. And so what actually happened was my company shut down and all of the stock I had went to zero. But a couple of important things came out of that. One was I realized, oh, I don't really understand how this equity works. And I need to educate myself because I'm a tech employee and this is an important part of my compensation. I started to do that. And then the second thing that came out of that was actually started me down the path of becoming a financial planner, making a career change into financial planning, which I did about a decade ago. And that's the reason I'm here today, is because I want to make sure that Airbnb employees, other tech professionals with equity, are able to make the most of that equity to get to their financial goals and not end up in a place where they don't get the value out of the hard work that they do. So that's why I'm here today. So let's get started. Let me share some slides with you. All right, so hopefully this is why you're all here. 5 steps for Airbnb employees make the most of their RSUs. So this is all for educational purposes. You should always talk to your professional. Here's what we're going to cover today. Give you a quick bit about my background, and I'm going to take you through the 5 steps. So step 1 is understand how your RSUs work. Step 2 is avoid a surprise tax bill from your RSUs. Step 3, determine if you have too much in your Airbnb RSUs. Step 4, decide when you should sell your RSUs. And step 5, plan what you should do with your proceeds. So this is going to take about 45 minutes. And then at the end, we're going to have some live questions and answers. So if you have questions as we go through the presentation, feel free to drop into the chat. At the end, I'll go back. I'm not going to answer them in real time, but if you have them there, I can refer back. And you can also ask me when we get to the live Q&A. Now, I've done a number of these. I recognize that some people are happy to ask their questions in live Q&A, but other people prefer to do it in a more private setting. So also, I want to make available for everybody, if you want to schedule a free virtual consultation with me to talk about your specific situation, I'm going to put up now a schedule now button. So if you click on the button, it'll take you to my calendar. You can put time in my calendar, and we can have a Zoom call and answer your specific questions about your specific situation. Okay. So we'll have the live Q&A, but if you prefer, you can just put time on my calendar. All right, so let's get started here. So quick background, I specialize in working with tech people with equity. I worked in tech myself about 20 years before making the career change. And really, the way you guys should think about this is you have this opportunity, you have these Airbnb RSUs that can give you a chance to get to your financial goals much faster than the typical corporate employee. Okay, so that's what we want to understand is how do you get to those goals faster. So step one is we want to understand how do your Airbnb RSUs work. Okay, so your Airbnb RSUs, it's just compensation in the form of Airbnb stock, and it vests over time. So the vesting schedule for most Airbnb employees is every quarter, and it all vests over a 4-year period. So you get your initial grant, and that is over 4 years, you'll be able to vest 100% of that initial grant. You may get refresh grants each year, and those will also vest over 4 years, typically. Okay. Now, what's important to understand about RSUs is their tax treatment. Okay, when you get your grant, say you start your job there, you get your initial grant, then you don't have to pay any taxes on that. Now, the day you vest, you pay ordinary income tax on whatever the value, the fair market value of the stock is when you vest. So the price of the stock on the day you vest. Ordinary income tax rate means you just pay what you would pay on your salary. All right. Now, one thing that's helpful for my clients is to have them view their RSUs as a cash bonus in the form of Airbnb stock. And that's because it gets taxed when it's vested. And that's different from other types of equity like incentive stock options or non-qualified stock options. So cash bonus. So here's one way that's helpful to think about it. I'm going to show you two versions of your RSUs. So the first one is your typical Airbnb RSU version, right? So say the company gives you $100,000 in Airbnb RSUs. They vest it today or, the 19th of Feb. And then what Airbnb does, they sell, let's say 40,000 of those RSUs. They cover your taxes, any other withholding, and then they leave you with whatever's left over. So in this case, let's say you now have 60,000 in your Fidelity account, right? 60,000 in Airbnb stock. That's what you got from your, that's what's left in your account. Okay. Other version, cash bonus version. Let's say Airbnb gives you $100,000 in cash bonus. They would take out their taxes like normal, withholding. So let's say they take out 40,000 and they put 60,000 into your checking account. Now, let's say you take that 60,000, you go into the stock market and you buy Airbnb stock. Now you own $60,000 of Airbnb stock. So in both versions, Airbnb RSU version, the cash bonus version, you end up in exactly the same place. You end up owning $60,000 in Airbnb stock. Okay, so that's why you can think of it as a cash bonus. You could get there with a cash bonus. Now, the reason I want you to think of it that way is because if the question I want you to ask yourself is, if Airbnb gave you cash bonus today, would the first thing you do with that cash be to go out and buy Airbnb stock? So when I ask most of my clients that question, they say, No, it's probably not the first thing I would do. So if you make the decision to hold your Airbnb RSUs, then it's the same as buying the stock at the current price. And if it's not the first thing you would do with a cash bonus, be to go buy Airbnb stock, then you should consider selling your RSUs. We're going to talk a bit more about selling later, but when you sell is going to depend on your specific situation, your goals, how concentrated you are, taxes. And you may want to talk to your professional about that. But in general, I recommend you sell as soon as you vest, because there's really no tax benefit for holding. Okay. And I do want to, sometimes clients will say to me, well, if I vest and then I hold it a year, I get long-term capital gains, the lower long-term capital gains tax treatment on that. And that's a misperception. So let me explain that. So if you vest today and you hold that RSUs more than a year, then it does qualify for long-term capital gains tax rate, the lower rate, which is the highest ordinary income federal rate's 37%. The highest long-term capital gains tax rate is 20%. So it's 17% lower. But let's say you vest your Airbnb, let's say it's 100. I want to keep the math simple today. You hold it more than a year, let's say it's 110. Okay, so now you sell it, you get the long-term capital gains tax treatment on that $10 gain. Okay. You do get a lower tax rate, but it's just on the gain. You're already taxed the $100 the day you vested, just like his ordinary income. Now, alternatively, if on the day you vest, you take the $100, you sell your shares, you go buy Airbnb, you hold it more than a year, it's 110, you sell it, that $10 is also qualified for long-term capital gains. So the fact that you're holding it a year doesn't change anything from what you could do if you just went out and bought it. So there really is no tax benefit for holding. All right, so that's how your RSUs work. Now, step 2 is you want to avoid a surprise tax bill on your RSUs. So I've heard this from a number of people, including my clients. So when I say surprise tax bill, what you want to understand is, have the taxes on your Airbnb RSUs been under withheld? All right. And as I said, you're going to pay ordinary income tax on the value of your RSUs when they vest, the stock price. Now, the company typically withholds at a standard rate, 22% federal rate for RSUs, unless you choose differently. They'll withhold a 22% rate. Now, for example, if you're actually at a 30% federal tax rate, highest tax rate, they've withheld 22%, but you have been under withheld 15% for those RSU. So for example, if you had $100,000 in RSUs that you vested, they're going to withhold $22,000, but you actually owe $37,000. So you still owe $15,000 in taxes. What happens is, many employees will say, oh, well, Airbnb already withheld the taxes, so I'm good to go, right? They sold them and gave me what's left over. Well, it depends. It depends on what your actual tax rate is. So if your tax rate's higher than the 20%, 22%, then you're being under withheld. And what happens is you get to April of the next tax year and you get this huge tax bill that is a surprise, not a good surprise. So the way to avoid that surprise tax bill, this is what I do with my clients, is we will work with a tax professional. We will do quarterly estimated tax payments. So we know each quarter, okay, were we with underheld? If so, how much? Let's go ahead and pay that. Or we'll at least sell enough RSUs, set aside in a tax reserve, so that when April comes, be able to pay taxes. Okay, won't be a surprise, and you'll have the cash to pay it. Okay. Again, this is general advice. if you have questions about your specific situation, about your specific tax bill, then again, as I said before, you can just click on the Schedule Now button, put time on my calendar, and we can talk about your specific situation. Okay, step 3. So we've talked about understand how your RSUs work, avoid a surprise tax bill. Step 3 is determine if you have too much in your Airbnb RSUs. So I talk with my clients about this concept of a concentrated stock position. Okay, and that just means you own too much of a single company's stock. And the way I define it generally is if it's more than 20% of your total investable assets. Okay. And that is if you compare a concentrated stock position versus a diversified portfolio, you just have a ton more risk volatility. And let me tell you a story that really illustrates that risk. So there was a company, you probably haven't heard, this happened in the late 90s. There's a company called Enron. It was an energy company that everybody loved. You know, Wall Street loved it, retail investors loved it, all the employees loved it. And what happened was stock went up and up and up, went up to $90 a share by 2000. And then some bad news came out. There was some accounting irregularities. And within a matter of a few months, stock dropped to 0. Okay. Now, the reason this is a story about concentration is that there were a number of Enron employees who had almost all of their net worth, all of their retirement savings invested in Enron stock. So within the company 401k, the company match was made in company stock. You could actually invest your company 401k in Enron stock. There's a way to purchase as an employee. So there were Enron employees who had almost all of their net worth in Enron stock, and it did very well for them for a long time. And then almost overnight, it went away. So there were employees who lost hundreds of thousands of dollars again overnight. That is the true risk of being too highly concentrated. You could lose everything very quickly for something that is with something that's completely beyond your control. So then the question is, well, how do you figure out, how do you determine if you have too much in your Airbnb? So we're going to walk through steps here, and I want you to do a quick back of the envelope version because I'm going to do a poll to figure out where people are. So step 1 is calculate the total value of your vested Airbnb equity. So that's your RSUs, and then if you're participating in the Employee Stock Purchase Plan, the ESPP, then you can count that too, and just use the current stock price. Okay, so you have that value. Step 2 would be calculate the total value of your investable assets. So that's all your other savings, investments, retirement, 401k. Add up that value. Okay, and then you add the total value to your vested equity. Simply, step 3 is you take the total value of vested equity, Airbnb equity, by the total investable assets. You get some percentage of concentration. Step 4 is if your concentration is more than 20%, you're highly concentrated, you should consider diversifying. So let's take a quick example here. Let's say you got 4,000 vested RSUs, $100 a share. That means you have $400,000 worth of vested equity. Okay. You add up your other savings, investments, 401ks, you got $600,000. That means your total investable assets is a $600,000 plus the $400,000. That gives you $1 million of total investable assets. And then you take your $400,000 of Airbnb, divide it by the million, you're 40%, you have 40% concentration. Okay. 40%'s greater than the 20% threshold, so you are highly concentrated. Now, just for context, again, I only work with tech people with equity, but I have people coming in with concentrations. It's not uncommon. They'll come in with 50% concentration, 80%, 90, 95, 98%. If you're an employee at a startup that's been very successful, it's very easy to be that highly concentrated. Okay. So I want you to do back of envelope in your head for this, and then I'm going to put up a quick poll here. So you should see the poll. The question is, how concentrated are you in your Airbnb RSUs? And you guys, again, follow these simple 4 steps. You get a sense of how concentrated you are. Got the results coming in. So looks like right now, for example, 7% of people between 80 to 100. So that's highly concentrated. Same for 60 to 80, about a 30, 40 to 60. Okay, let me give you 10 more seconds, and then I'm going to close the poll here. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, here we go. All right, so we have 31% that are 0 to 20. So that's really based on this guideline, you are not highly concentrated. That means the other 70% of you are highly concentrated. And you can see we got about 20%, 20 to 40%, and then 30%, 40 to 60, 12.5, 60, 80, 6%, 80 to 100. Okay, so this is not surprising, but anybody, 70% of you right now should be thinking about, okay, I'm highly concentrated. What should I do about that? All right. So step 4, let's decide when you should sell your Airbnb or RSUs. Okay, so we talked about how do they work? How do you avoid a surprise tax bill? How do you figure out if you have too much? Now let's decide when you should sell them. This is probably the key question for most people. So here are the steps that I suggest you walk through when you think about selling your RSUs. So first of all, I would think about, do you have any valid near-term cash needs? And examples of these are, do you need to pay taxes on your employee equity? So for example, if you're under withheld 15%, go ahead and sell your RSUs because you're going to have to pay those taxes now or come April of next year. Do you have an emergency fund? So this is, job loss, medical emergencies. You want to have cash to be able to pay that. Down payment. You want to buy a house? You want to buy the house in 6 months? Then you need the cash to be able to buy that house. So if you have any valid near-term cash needs, I would say sell. Take your money off the table because you have something you clearly need to use it for in the near term. Okay? So you carve that out. The next question you want to ask yourself is, because I have clients all the time who come to me and say, well, I'm a big believer in my company. Long-term has a very bright future. So I want to make sure I have some stake in the company. So decide if you want to keep some percentage of your equity for the long term. And so if you're a big believer, you want to make sure you keep it in, then that's fine. You just need to figure out how much you want to keep. I recommend, my clients typically recommend at most you have 5 to 10% of your total investable assets, but you got to figure out what you're comfortable with, what you want to do. But let's say you say, okay, I'm going to carve out 10%. Carve out 10%. You've sold what you need for near-term cash needs. You've carved out your 10%. Okay, let's talk about the remaining shares. So there are three approaches to this. One approach is sell immediately. Okay, that's simple. Window's open right now. You just say, look, I'm going to keep everything simple. I sell everything. I'll have cash. I can go ahead and diversify. I have future equity, so if there is upside, that's what I'll say is here. There is data I've seen which says for on average for most tech IPOs, it makes sense to sell sooner rather than later. So selling immediately is a reasonable option. Okay, now, having said that, most of my clients will say, well, I can't get comfortable with that. And there are a couple of benefits of selling over time. One is you don't happen to pick the single wrong day to sell, right? It happens to be at a low point. Two, you have more control over your tax bill. So you can spread it out over a couple of years, multiple years, okay? So the next two versions are, well, the next version is sell over time on a schedule, okay? And so, for example, you can say, I'm going to sell 25% a quarter every quarter over the next 4 quarters, or 10% a quarter every quarter over the next 10 quarters. The idea is you set up a schedule that when the window opens, you sell it. You don't try to guess, is the stock high enough or is the stock too low? Should I sell it? You just sell, and you're trying to put it on autopilot because that minimizes the emotions, and you're able to just automatically diversify over time. Okay, so this sell over time on a schedule is a way, and it gets you those benefits. You're not going to sell on the single wrong day because it'll go up and down, and you'll also be able to spread it over time, multiple tax years. The third version is you sell over time on a schedule, but you can sell more when the price is higher and less when it's lower. So for example, you could say, okay, if the price is 100 or less, I'm going to sell 15%. If it's between 100 and 150, I'm going to sell 25%. If it's more than 150, I'm going to sell 50%. Okay. So that you get to each quarter, you look at your target, your ranges, and you say, okay, well, price is lower than 100, I'm going to sell 15%. Or it's really high, more than 150, I'm going to sell 50%. So again, a way to put it on autopilot, minimize your motion, but this way you're able to sell more when it's higher, less when it's lower. Okay, those are 3 ways of thinking about selling your RSUs. But these 3 steps: cover any near-term valid cash needs, decide if you want to keep some percentage, take the rest, and sell using one of these ways. Okay, step 5, plan what you should do with your proceeds. So you've sold, now you get these proceeds, what do you do? So again, step 1 was understand how your RSUs work. Step 2 is avoid surprise tax bill. Step 3 is determine if you have too much. Step 4 is decide when to sell. Step 5 is what do you do with the proceeds? Get this cash. So ideally what you do is you develop a financial plan, has both your near-term, long-term goals to understand, okay, how can I use these proceeds to reach those goals? This is what I do with my clients, but I want you to think about, you got these proceeds, or you could have these proceeds. How can you use those to help you reach your goals? So I'm going to do one last poll here. So you should see that in a little bit. So the poll is, what is your primary goal that you want to use these RSUs, the proceeds, to help you achieve. And the different options here are financial independence, buy a house, education. That's probably for your kids. If you have kids, family support, start your own business, other. So coming in, looks like big winner so far is leading the pack is financial independence. House running second. Other, family support. Okay. Let me give you another 10 seconds to respond if you want to respond. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, we are going to close the poll. So here's where we ended up. Hang on. Well, my results did not. Okay, here's where I ended up. About 70% financial independence, 15% house, 12% other, and the remaining family support. Okay. All right. So it sounds like most of you guys are thinking about financial independence, and then some of you house and others. So let's talk about this. So whatever proceeds you have, the first thing you want to understand is what is the time horizon for that goal. Okay. And the simple way to think about it is it a near-term goal versus a long-term? And the way I define near-term is anywhere less than a year or two. Okay. And examples are taxes and emergency fund, down payment if I'm going to buy a house in that time frame. Long-term is more than 2 years. Those are things like financial independence. This is probably the big one. But if you have kids, for example, college. So after you understand your goal and the time horizon, the next thing you want to understand is, okay, what is your risk tolerance? Okay, that means how comfortable are you with risk? So a good way to think about this is when COVID hit in March, April of 2020, the market dropped about 35% in a month. Okay. So you want to ask yourself, when that happened, how did you respond? If you were aware of it and you were worried about it and you took some kind of action, like you actually thought about, or you sold all your investments because you were worried the market was going to keep going down, then you probably have very low risk tolerance. If you're like, oh, here's a buying opportunity, I can buy it when everything's low, I'm going to put more money into the market, then you probably have a very high risk tolerance. If you were somewhere in between, you're probably somewhere in the middle. So you probably have a sense of your risk tolerance based on your own behavior. If you want to go online, you can find a way to look at that. But you want to understand your risk tolerance. So looking at both your time horizon and your risk tolerance, you can decide on what we planners call asset allocation. That's just some mix between stocks, bonds, and cash. So for example, if you have a near-term goal, say you have low risk tolerance, then you want to keep it in something that is highly liquid, that you're not going to lose money with, and it's safe. So like a savings account. So if I have a down payment, I'm going to buy a house in 6 months, put it in a savings account. That's fine, because 6 months when you want to buy the house, it will still be there. Okay. If you put it in a stock market and then another COVID hits and your down payment, it's down by 35%, that's not a great place to be. Long-term goals like financial independence, you want some mix of stocks and bonds. Okay. So if you, in general, the longer your time horizon, the higher your risk tolerance, the more risk you're comfortable taking, the more risk you can take, and you can put a higher percentage in stocks. Now, a simple rule of thumb, when you think about something like financial independence, the long-term goal, is you take 120 and you subtract your age. Okay. So for example, if you have 120, let's say you're 30, 120 minus 30 means 90. 90% should go into stocks. The remaining 10% should go into bonds. Okay. That's a very simple rule of thumb, but that's just a way to think about how do you get to that mix of stocks and bonds. Okay. If you happen to be 50, then you take 120 minus 50, 70% stocks, 30% bonds. Okay. Depends on many factors, but that's just a high level way of thinking about it. Now, for financial independence, retirement, which is the long time horizon, typically depending on how old you are, what you want to do is you want to invest in a broadly diversified, globally allocated, cost-effective portfolio of stocks and bonds. Okay. So that means broadly diversified means you want different asset classes and different geographies. So US large cap stocks, US small cap stocks, international stocks, emerging stocks, US bonds, international bonds. Those are the key asset classes you're globally allocated. So some mix like that is how you'd want to think about investing in the long term for something like financial independence. Okay. All right. So let's talk about next steps. Now we've covered the 5 steps. Just to recap. Understand how your Airbnb RSUs work. Explain that. 2, avoid a surprise tax bill. 3, determine how concentrated you are in your Airbnb RSUs, how much you got. Okay. Step 4 is decide how to sell or when to sell those Airbnb RSUs. Step 5, you've sold them, you have the proceeds, plan what to do with that. Okay, so that's a high level way I would think about making the most of your RSUs. And again, if you have questions about your specific situation, then you can go to this URL or to the schedule now button and just put time on calendar. And I'm happy to talk to you about your specific situation, your specific planning questions. Before we do the Q&A, I want to do a quick, do one more story just to give you some perspective on this. And that is, I call it my Yellow Jacket story. So a few years ago, we had Yellow Jackets in our backyard. And my wife said to me, hey, can you call the exterminator, have them take care of the Yellow Jackets? And I said, honey, I can take care of this. So I went out back. I had a bunch of bug spray, started spraying the Yellow Jackets. And then the next thing I know, I had a dozen Yellow Jackets all over my head, stinging me. And I was in such a state that I actually ran into our house to find my wife to help me out. And I ran through our closed screen door. But eventually my wife hosed my head down, got all the Yellow Jackets off. And I called the exterminator. Exterminator came, got rid of the Yellow Jackets. Now, the reason I tell you this story is because there are times when you have something important you want done in your life. You can do it yourself, but if you have, if it's important enough and you want to hire a professional who does this every day, then you may end up in a better place than if you try to do it yourself. My case, I should have just called the exterminator right away. All right, so let's take a minute here now to answer any questions. And let me first go back to the chat. I'm going to go look here. And if you have any other questions, feel free to drop into the chat, but we're just going to go through the questions here. Okay, so first question is from Rajiv. What % of your assets in Airbnb is too dangerous? Okay, so I think this is when I talked about being highly concentrated is more than 20% of your investable assets. So if you have more than 20%, then you should think about you're highly concentrated based on how I define it, and you should think about diversifying. That is my recommendation. It also depends a lot on your risk tolerance and your time horizon. So if you have very high risk tolerance and you still have got 50 years to work, then you may be willing to take more risk, and you may say it's 30% or it's 40%. Okay. But really, once you get by that 20%, then that's when I would think about it seriously. And you guys, if you've been an Airbnb employed long enough, you've already gone through this, right? The stock has been a lot higher than it was today. And, you know, at a certain point, you could have lost 50% of that Airbnb value. Okay, so Claire. Oh, sorry. Follow up on the question above. When calculating the percentage, should we consider those future vests? So, in general, I would first do it without considering the future vests, okay? Because that gives you the picture of what is reality today. Because if you leave tomorrow, you don't get any of those, any of the equity that you haven't vested yet. However, it is certainly reasonable to consider if you have a significant amount of RSUs that you're going to vest in the future. You could look at it two ways. You could say, okay, what have I vested? What percent is that? And then what is unvested? And then that gives you a sense of if you, for example, had 90% that is of your net worth that's unvested, then you may say, well, let me go ahead and take some off the table now because I got plenty left, plenty upside left in the future. On the other hand, if 90% of it's vested and just 10% is unvested, then you may say, okay, this is the unvested portion isn't that important. So that's how I would think about it. Okay. And I'm now realizing I should, how's the 20% determined as the recommendation? So that is my general guideline. And that is based on a bunch of academic research which shows that there's much higher risk with higher concentration, and kind of the optimal balance between risk and reward is, in fact, they typically show, most planners will probably say 15% in a single security. But I work with plenty of Silicon Valley people. I don't know how realistic that is. That's how I came up with the 20%. If you hold on more, it's all risk reward, right? If you have 90% of your net worth in Airbnb, you are taking on a ton of risk. You aren't necessarily, it may work out. I'm not saying, this doesn't mean it won't work out, but in general, on average, 20% is kind of the sweet spot. You know, plenty of early Google, Amazon, Apple employees held on to everything, and it paid off for them. It just means they took on more risk than they needed to. Okay. Who knows? All right. And then Prane asks, what do you recommend after selling? Like what to do with the money put in index? So yes, as I said, broadly diversified, globally allocated portfolio. Index funds are an example of something like that, as long as you can, again, have it diversified across those different asset classes and across the different geographies that I mentioned. For example, an S&P 500 index fund, that's all US large cap stocks. So you have it in a single asset class and you have it in a single geography. So that's not a diversified portfolio. Okay, Rajiv, what is your favorite bond index fund? Okay. So if you're looking for a very low cost bond index fund, again, I would be diversified US and international. But for example, if you go to a place like Vanguard and you get their bond index funds, those should be fine. Anything like Vanguard, Fidelity, Schwab should be fine. Okay. Dana, what do you consider price at which equity is granted when considering when to sell? So Dana, if you have RSUs, which almost at this point, almost all Airbnb employees have RSUs, then your grant price doesn't really matter, because again, you're going to get taxed on whatever the price is on the day you vest. Okay. So if your grant price, the stock was at $5 versus 100, doesn't really matter. If the price is 130 today, it's going to be, that's what you're going to get taxed on. Okay. This is assuming you have RSUs. Now, if you were an early Airbnb employee, you may have either incentive stock options or non-qualified stock options where you have an exercise price. Then it matters a lot. But that's there's a lot of complexity. That would be a whole presentation unto itself. RSUs, the grant price doesn't really matter, but if you have options, then they do matter, because that then drives how much in taxes you can pay, in taxes you have to pay. Okay. Any other questions here? Any other questions? Okay, if you got any other questions, then feel free to drop in the chat. Okay, so I'm not seeing anything right now. So I want to, again, if you guys have specific questions about your specific situation, feel free to click on the Schedule Now button or go to this URL, or you can just email me, tom@vestafinancialplanning.com. I want to thank you all for coming today. And if I will, just so you know, I will send out a recording to this. If you found this helpful, then, or if you want to review back, you can do that. Or if you want to share with any of your coworkers, then feel free to do that. But thanks again. Appreciate the time. Thanks, everybody.